Hidden in the desolate plains where North Dakota bleeds into Saskatchewan, there is a scar on the earth the government wants you to forget. Not a small scar, not a footnote. A wound, concrete, steel, and radioactive memory buried beneath fields that now grow wheat as if nothing ever happened beneath them. Farmers drive combines over ground that once held the most destructive weapons ever assembled by human hands. Their children play within miles of cracked concrete domes that still exhale the chemical ghosts of rocket propellant. And somewhere in the bureaucratic no-man's land between two countries, a question has never been fully answered. Who is responsible for what was left behind? This is the story of Code 990, a designation that appears in declassified Air Force documents and then vanishes. A story of a multi-billion-dollar nuclear network, built in panic, abandoned in silence, and left to quietly decay on the knife edge of an international border. The year was 1955. The Soviet Union had detonated its first thermonuclear device 2 years earlier. American military planners were not sleeping. They were drawing lines on maps, very specific lines, and the line that mattered most ran along the 49th parallel, the longest undefended border in the world. And, in the language of Cold War strategy, undefended was a vulnerability that could not stand. The logic of the Minuteman and the earlier Atlas missile programs was brutal in its simplicity. If a Soviet bomber or ballistic missile was coming from the north, and it would always come from the north, over the polar arc, over the Arctic, then the first line of interception had to be as far north as possible. The DEW line, the distant early warning system, would detect the threat. But detection alone meant nothing without the capacity to respond before the warheads reached Chicago or Detroit or Washington. So, the military looked at the map and made a calculation that would later strike many analysts as strategically reckless, though at the time it felt like brilliance. They would build the launch infrastructure as close to the Canadian border as American soil allowed, close enough that the flight time from silo to Soviet target was compressed to its minimum, close enough that the silos themselves sat in a landscape so flat, so exposed, so remote, that concealment seemed almost beside the point. The emptiness was the camouflage. Bases expanded across North Dakota. Minot Air Force Base became one of the most important nuclear installations on the planet. Missile wings fanned out across the plains in configurations that looked, from above, like the spokes of a wheel pressed flat against the earth. And some of those spokes reached very far north, in some cases uncomfortably, ambiguously far north. The 49th parallel does not announce itself. There are no walls. In those remote stretches of the northern plains, there are sometimes not even fences. The survey markers are old, occasionally disputed, and in a landscape where the horizon is everything, the exact location of the international boundary can become a legal matter requiring specialists, not a geographic reality visible to the naked eye. This is where the anomaly begins. The military knew what it was doing when it placed certain installations in the border corridor. What it did not fully anticipate was what decommissioning those installations would look like 40 years later. The technical designation that resurfaces in documents from the 1990s and early 2000s, Code 990, refers not to a single site, but to a classification protocol, a way of marking installations whose legal status under international environmental treaty obligations was considered unresolved. The problem was layered. First, there was the physical reality. Missile silos are not simply holes in the ground. They are engineered ecosystems. Concrete launch tubes descending 60, 80, sometimes over 100 feet. Underground equipment rooms connected by tunnels. Fuel storage cavities lined with materials that do not degrade gracefully. When a silo is decommissioned, the official process involves flooding the shaft, destroying the mechanical infrastructure, and capping the surface. In the interior of a continent, this is already a complicated remediation challenge. On the border, it becomes a jurisdictional puzzle with no clean solution. Canadian environmental law requires disclosure and remediation of any contaminated site that could affect Canadian soil or water. American decommissioning protocols classify the technical specifications of former launch sites under provisions of national security that resist full disclosure even decades after the weapons are gone. These two frameworks do not simply disagree. They are, in places, flatly incompatible. There are documented cases in declassified correspondence between the EPA, the Army Corps of Engineers, and unnamed Canadian provincial authorities where the same patch of land appears in documents under different jurisdictional assumptions. In the American documents, it is American territory undergoing American-managed remediation. In the Canadian correspondence, it is flagged as an area of concern pending review. The same coordinates, different conclusions. The underground water table does not care about this disagreement. Beneath those plains, aquifer systems run continuously and without regard for the lines humans drew on maps. Propellant residue, hydraulic fluid, the chemical compounds used in the construction and maintenance of mid-century military infrastructure, these do not stay where they are placed. They migrate. They follow the gradient of the Earth. And in some sections of the border corridor, the gradient runs north. The Code 990 classification, to the extent it has been reconstructed from available documents, appears to designate sites where the contamination boundary, the actual chemical footprint of the installation, does not correspond to the political boundary. Sites where what America buried is, by the physics of groundwater movement, no longer exclusively America's problem. There has never been a formal joint remediation agreement published for this corridor. There have been discussions. There have been working groups. There have been documents that were reviewed and then classified again. The scar runs deeper than the concrete. Today, those installations exist in a strange second life. The silos that were clearly on American soil, clearly within military jurisdiction, clearly documented, many of those have been sold. The Air Force divested dozens of former Minuteman sites across North Dakota in the years following the Cold War. Some became private property. Some were purchased by individuals who converted the underground spaces into survival bunkers, data storage facilities, or simply curiosities. The paperwork for these sales exists. The buyers are on record, but the installations in the border corridor, the ones carrying the Code 990 designation or its equivalents, exist in a different state. They did not cleanly transfer to private ownership. They did not cleanly remain in federal custody. They exist in a gap in the administrative record that has never been fully closed. Urban explorers began documenting these sites in the late 2000s and throughout the 2010s. The photography that emerged from those expeditions is striking in a way that goes beyond simple industrial decay. These are not abandoned factories. They are not derelict warehouses. The scale of the underground infrastructure encountered suddenly beneath a field that appears entirely ordinary from the road produces a specific kind of vertigo. The access hatches where they remain are often unlocked. Not because security has been deliberately removed, because no one has been clearly assigned the responsibility of maintaining it. Inside, the conditions document decades of uncontrolled deterioration, standing water in the equipment rooms, corrosion on infrastructure that was built to withstand a direct nuclear strike. In several documented cases, the concrete of the launch tube itself has cracked along fault lines created not by weapons, but by frost and time, the same forces that fracture roads and split foundations across the northern plains every winter. The cracked concrete is not merely an aesthetic problem. The launch tubes in a Minuteman-era silo were engineered with specific drainage assumptions. Water was not supposed to pool inside them. When it does, it contacts whatever residual materials remain in the shaft, and those materials, even after partial decommissioning, are not neutral. The runoff that eventually migrates outward carries a chemical signature that environmental scientists have identified in soil sampling done in the border corridor, though the specific attribution of those readings to specific installations remains, in official documentation, unresolved. The border does not keep these compounds contained. The aquifer that feeds wells in southern Saskatchewan does not originate in Saskatchewan. The water moving through that system comes from further south, from plains that grew wheat over concrete, from fields that look from the road like any other fields in any other part of the middle of the continent. The people who live above this system did not choose to live above a nuclear legacy. They simply live where they have always lived, and the water comes to them from below the ground, as it always has. There is no clean resolution to this story because there has been no clean resolution to the underlying problem. The silos of the border corridor remain in their administrative limbo. The Code 990 designation floats through the declassified record as a marker of something the government identified but never fully addressed. The contamination boundary continues to migrate at the speed of groundwater. The access hatches sit unlocked above cracked concrete above water that is moving north. These installations were built as instruments of deterrence. The theory was that the threat of annihilation would prevent annihilation, and perhaps it did, in the narrow sense that the weapons were never launched. But deterrence as a concept was always concerned with the catastrophic event. It had nothing to say about the slow, quiet, unglamorous aftermath. The decades of migration, the wells, the soil, the bureaucratic gap between two countries where the responsibility sits and waits. These silos are a monument to human fear. Fear built them in a matter of years. Neglect has maintained them ever since. But 2,000 miles away, in the deep Alaskan ice, there is a border installation that was never built to launch weapons. It was built to listen, to detect something moving beneath the surface of the ocean, a signal that the engineers who designed the system described in their own documents as unlike anything they had encountered before, a signal that did not match any known Soviet signature.